How's it going, ladies and gentlemen? This is Philosophossum, and well, any of you who have been following my channel should be familiar with the user who goes by Professor Stick. If not, I'll get you briefly up to speed. He's a YouTuber who advocates for mask wearing. Now recently he responded to one of my videos where I responded to him, which itself was a video responding to Computing Forever, which of course was addressing the issue of whether or not masks should be made compulsory in public. Well, not too long ago I made a response to his response, adding yet another layer of response to this whole response lasagna, and funny enough, that very morning I released that response video, Professor Stick actually released a part 2 to his whole response to me. Yeah, apparently I was popular enough amongst his fans. You guys remember Professor Stick's fans, the guys who went in my comment section to be total dicks? Well, it turns out I was popular enough among them that Professor Stick decided a part 2 was in order.
Part 2? Part 2, part 2, part 2,
please don't do that.
Now, truth be told, I wasn't originally planning on responding to part 2 of his response, because, well, quite frankly, it's just not as interesting. Like, it's not as juicy as the first part. He doesn't do anything like take what I say out of context and make it seem like I'm selfish like he does in the first part. I mean, to be completely honest with you, he's actually more intellectually honest in this second part of it. Like, it seems like he's more focused on offering constructive criticism as opposed to simply bashing. Which, I mean, isn't a bad thing, don't get me wrong, but it does make it kind of less interesting to respond to. That being said though, he still does say a few things that I've determined to be response worthy, so I figured, you know, what the hell, why not? So before we get into the video, I just want to point out real quickly, both the title of this video and the thumbnail show us some hypocrisy on behalf of Stickboy here. The video is called Stomping on Rats. You know, once again, Mr. Biology Professor conflates a rat and an opossum. His thumbnail also depicts me being stomped on by his Stick character. I'm sorry, but wasn't this the same guy who was just lecturing us about how horribly wrong and evil it is to put other people in harm's way? Or is there some sort of exception to that for people who hold opinions you disagree with? Well, I don't imagine being stomped on with his little tiny stick feet would hurt particularly bad, but still, the idea, the concept.
Hey everyone, Happy New Year! Yay! We have finally gotten through 2020. If you haven't already, post your New Year's resolutions in the comment section below, or tweet them to me.
Well, good sir, since you were kind enough to ask, my New Year's resolution would be to try and grow my YouTube channel. I mean, thus far it seems to be going pretty well. I've gained like another 20 subscribers in the past month. Another resolution of mine would be to start earning money on Patreon, which you, dear viewer, can generously help me accomplish. A link will be in the description. You can check out my Patreon page, see all the wonderful benefits you'll receive from becoming a patron for as little as $2 a month.
That way you can come back to this video a few days later and realize how miserably you failed.
Oh, come on now, you'll never accomplish anything with a cynical attitude like that.
Anyway, what shall we talk about today? Although I said I was going to make a part 2 to the possum.
Oh, so now you know that I'm a possum. What, it took you this long in your response to actually get that right?
I never intended to. But the voice of the people on Twitter must be heard. If you haven't followed me there, then please do so.
Well, look at that. I guess I am popular among his fans after all.
There's been a vaccine video that I've been holding on to for over a month now, so we'll be releasing that next week no matter what happens. No more. This is the last time I'm responding to this guy. Lots of other fish in the sea. Except bad fish, you know.
Aw, that's a shame, Stickboy. I was looking forward to more responses from you. What, you don't enjoy responding to my videos or something? Joking aside though, I do plan to revisit this Professor Stick guy in the future. He actually has quite a few videos where he advocates for masks and other forms of coronavirus authoritarianism.
Then the next week after, we'll do a creationism video.
So yeah, even though I disagree with this guy's political views, he does do a fairly good job at debunking creationism and other forms of pseudoscience. Yeah, for some reason, people who are really smart about science always tend to be hardcore left-wing government ass-kissers. Like if this guy would take the same scientific skepticism he applies to creationism and applied it to the COVID hysteria, he'd be golden.
Alright, let's begin. Continuing on where we left off. Now, this next part, he plays a relatively long portion of my video. I'm going to skip it since it's not really new content, and you can find it in the original video anyway. Basically, it's a short lesson on why exposing yourself to other pathogens is not going to help you much against COVID-19. In general, your adaptive immune response is specific to what it fights and what it fought. It's nothing groundbreaking, and the concept is very simple. Let's see what he has to say.
So I didn't really comment much during the parts of the video where he goes into detail on scientific scientific or technical explanations. He is correct to point that out. And well, quite simply, that's just because I didn't really have much to say. There's primarily two reasons for this. The first reason is that I'm not really an expert in immunology. Now, of course, I do understand the basics of how white blood cells and T cells work. I've used some basic facts about immunology in some of my other videos on COVID-19, so it's not necessarily something I'm totally oblivious on, but at the same time, it's not really a field that I've studied in depth or have extensive expertise in, or at least not enough to comment on how accurate what Professor Stick is saying. The second reason is that, well, quite frankly, it simply doesn't interest me as much. Now, don't get me wrong, I do think that human immunology is an interesting field to learn about, but the main thing I'm concerned about is the fact that people are being forced to wear masks against their will. So that's where most of my criticisms are focused on. While the facts regarding immunology and how effective the masks are interesting to me, they're not the main thing I'm concerned about. You see, for me, the main issue isn't whether or not the masks are effective at protecting people from the virus, it's whether or not people are being forced to wear them. If all Professor Stick was doing in the video was pointing out how effective masks are at protecting people from the virus, and he was encouraging people to wear them voluntarily, I wouldn't even bother making a response to him. But he does seem sympathetic to the idea of the government forcing people to wear masks against their will. Granted, he never directly calls for mask mandates, but he does generally seem sympathetic toward them. Alright, so a couple things to say here. First of all, this was kind of an information dump. He was kind of throwing out all these technical concepts while speaking quickly. Oftentimes when someone is a professional in a particular field, they're used to working around other professionals in that field. They're used to explaining things using all sorts of technical jargon. This is why a lot of times people who are really smart about a particular subject will have difficulty explaining it in a way that makes sense to a layperson.
Yeah, I mean, I get it. I do speak fast, and that's just what I do when speaking into a microphone sometimes. But the concept is not something you need a degree in biology to understand. Honestly, it's high school level science. If you've taken biology in high school at all, you would have learned about the immune system at least to the level that I just explained. The stuff we deal with in laboratories and such are concepts much more complicated that I wouldn't even try to explain it to a layperson. I've made plenty of other videos where the level exceeds high school or even undergraduate college level biology, but this is not one of them. It's fine if any of you don't understand it though. I didn't mean to be rude, so I do apologize if it came off that way. I'll simplify it a bit further so everyone can understand. Your immune system can be divided into two different types of responses. The innate immune response is non-specific and fast-acting, while the adaptive immune response is slow but strong. When you fight an infection, ultimately it's going to be the adaptive immune response that eliminates the pathogen, but since it is slow to build up, you will suffer the symptoms before you get better. However, that is not the case for pathogens that you have already fought before, because your adaptive immune response has a memory system where the cells that fought the pathogen stick around a bit. That way, if you see the same infection again, you can have an instant adaptive response, which would eliminate the disease before you experience symptoms. However, this adaptive immune response is specific to what it fought before, which means exposing yourself to other non-related pathogens will not help in combating a novel virus. I hope that made it more clear.
So I should preface this by saying that in the original video I did understand the gist of what he was saying. He was basically saying that exposing your immune system to pathogens in general doesn't necessarily better equip your immune system to deal with COVID-19 specifically. I understood that. I just kind of took issue with the way he explained it. I feel that maybe there's a better way of explaining it. Which, I mean, he does do here. He comes out and offers a more clear explanation of the idea. I mean, credit where credit's due. I do have to appreciate that he did admit that he speaks a little bit fast, and he did come out and offer a more clear explanation. You know, it shows that he really was listening to my criticisms and was willing to go back and maybe correct the way he did something. You know, I usually don't see this type of intellectual honesty in videos that I respond to, so I definitely have to give him kudos for this. Now, as an IT professional, I'm often finding myself in situations where I have to work with or help people who may not know a whole lot about computers. So I do understand the difficulty of needing to explain technical concepts in a way that a layperson can understand. It can be tricky sometimes, so this I do kind of understand.
We probably understand each other a lot more than either of us would like to admit, since I do a bit of IT stuff in my job as well. And boy, helping someone who has no computer knowledge and don't even know what Google Chrome is can be a massive pain sometimes.
Well, see, Professor, look, we do have something in common after all. But yeah, the main point I was trying to explain here is that when you're an expert in a particular field, he's an expert in biology, I'm an expert in computers, you have knowledge on a particular field above that which an ordinary person would have. Therefore, difficulties can arise when you're in a situation where you have to explain your field to a layperson. I used to work IT help desk all the time. I would have to help people with their computer issues that they wouldn't understand. Like one day someone was calling help desk because an application they were running kept giving them a network timeout error, and well, long story short, using a packet sniffer at the user's computer and analyzing the configuration file on the gateway router on their network, I figured out that the issue was that the application they were using operates over FTP, while their network firewall is only configured to allow SSH traffic. Now, to me, I understand the issue perfectly well, but to them I'm practically speaking Japanese. But what he was basically saying there was that exposing your immune system to a variety of pathogens doesn't necessarily better equip your immune system to deal with COVID-19 specifically. So this guy's an expert in biology and immunology. I'm not, so I'm going to have to kind of take his word on this. But even if it's not necessarily the case that exposing yourself to pathogens in general better prepares your body to deal with COVID-19, maybe the idea is that exposing yourself to COVID-19 makes your immune system better at fighting COVID-19.
Yes, that is certainly the case. If your body has fought COVID-19 before, it should develop the memory cells to have a quick adaptive response the next time around. That's the entire concept of vaccinations, where we inject you with the antigens of the pathogen, for example, which is just the surface proteins your immune system recognizes, and it will fight it by generating the cells that target specifically that disease. As an analogy, it's kind of like learning to sword fight by fighting a pillow dummy. But in the case of the immune system, you'd only be better equipped to fight people that are similar to the dummy. Once you fight a different person, maybe of different size or type than the dummy, then all you've learned is useless and you start back from square one. And of course, when enough people have developed an immunity to the pathogen, then herd immunity is achieved. You can obtain this in a population by either vaccinating enough people or enough people have to suffer through the infection first.
I'm glad he is at least pointing out the fact that you can also achieve herd immunity through your body's natural immune response, and not just through vaccination, because with all the emphasis being put on the vaccinations, I feel like this fact is often getting overlooked. As a matter of fact, for those who aren't aware, recently the CDC was up to something rather fishy. They actually changed the definition of herd immunity to only include vaccinations and not natural immune response. Now, I'm not sure whether or not they're pursuing some sort of political agenda, but the fact that they're just brazenly willing to change well-established facts about science on a whim like that, it definitely raises an eyebrow.
Obviously, the first option is better because it would avoid the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in the case of COVID.
So notice the way he's framing this issue here. There's two options and one of them is obviously better than the other. Is that an accurate way of framing the issue though? Because while I won't deny that keeping yourself hunkered down until a vaccine is available might be the best option for certain more vulnerable people, most young healthy people either don't show any symptoms or only show very minor symptoms. For them it may be more worthwhile to just go out, live their lives as normal, build up an immunity the natural way. Professor Stick is correct to point out that there are two possible paths to herd immunity, but he's incorrect in implying that one path is necessarily better for everybody.
Which is why it is important to take these precaution measures such as wearing a mask until enough people have been vaccinated. At this point in time, we have many vaccinations that have been approved already for emergency use, so it's not going to be too much longer. I predict it will be somewhere between April and July when regular people who aren't healthcare workers or high-risk individuals will get the vaccine.
You know what I think is actually pretty funny? Before the vaccine came out, all the politicians and elites were like, as soon as this vaccine comes out, we're going to be ready to roll this shit out pronto, we're going to vax as many people as possible. Well, now that the vaccine is out, they seem to be rather selective about who does and doesn't get the vax. At a lot of vaccination centers, doctors are being told to throw out any leftover vax, as opposed to giving it to people who aren't approved to take it yet. Ironically, this actually undermines a lot of the vaccine conspiracy theories, because you'd think if there was some kind of nefarious intention behind the vaccines, the elites would just be handing them out to the general public and not hoarding them for themselves.
Until then, wear a mask.
You know, the goalposts for when all this bullshit will be over, you know, when we can ditch the stupid masks and get back to our normal lives, seems to constantly be moving. When all this bullshit started a year ago, it was 15 days to slow the spread. Then it became wait until there's a vaccine. Now a whole fucking year later, and there's multiple vaccines, they're once again moving the goalpost. They're saying, well, even with a vaccine, you can't have your life back. Like, the whole selling point of this vaccine was that once we took it, we could go back to our normal lives. If I still have to wear the stupid face diaper even after I take the vax, what's even the point of taking the vax then?
The severity of a disease is not only determined by the death rate. In fact, a higher death rate could very well mean less people die because it wouldn't be able to spread as far. That's why Ebola will never become a global pandemic.
It is true that deadlier diseases tend to spread more slowly because the people who catch them have less of an opportunity to spread them around. I've actually made this point in several of my previous videos I've done on COVID-19. So yeah, less deadly diseases tend to spread around quicker, that's true. However, since the disease is less deadly, wouldn't that also mean it's less of a problem if it spreads around?
For a novel virus that has an easy method of spreading, you can have one of two scenarios here. Either it's deadly and it doesn't spread as much, or it's less deadly and it spreads more. When you say, quote, since the disease is less deadly, wouldn't that mean it's less of a problem if it spreads around? It seems like you're saying it's better than a deadly disease that also spreads fast. In which case, that simply doesn't exist and won't exist in modern times, so it's simply useless to say it could be worse, when that worst scenario will never really happen.
I think Professor Stick was a bit confused on what it was I was trying to get across here. I wasn't necessarily trying to argue that COVID isn't that big of a deal because it could be worse. Like, I do agree with Professor Stick that diseases that are deadly and spread quickly are something you don't really see. Since I do agree with him on this, it seems kind of strange that he would think that's the point I'm trying to get across. The main point I was trying to get across there, and is a point I've made in several of my other videos I've done on COVID, if a disease has a very small chance of killing you, is it really that big of a deal if you catch it? Or let me phrase it another way. Suppose there was one disease that you had a 99% chance of catching, but only 1% chance of killing you. And another disease that you had only 1% chance of catching, but a 99% chance of killing you. I think most people would rather deal with the former disease, because even though there's basically a guaranteed chance of you catching it, there's almost no possibility of it killing you, as opposed to the other disease, which even though there's a very small chance of you catching it, if you catch it, it's basically a death sentence.
But anyway, I want to make 2 points to what you said. First of all, this disease may not have a very high death rate, but its risk is very high to certain groups of people. Individuals who are older in age or have pre-existing conditions will have a much greater risk. To them, it means so much for others to wear a mask. For younger people like us, the death rate is less than 1%. But let's say you're an older individual, say 80, where if you got the virus, your chances of dying skyrockets to 15%. Think about that. Not to mention, that would involve a long period of hospitalizations and ICU treatments. The story is very different depending on the individual.
Well, yes, I'm well aware that certain groups of people are more susceptible to the virus. There's nothing saying that we can't target protective measures specifically towards them, while letting young healthy people go out and live their lives. This is the whole idea behind the Great Barrington Declaration. Having protective measures targeted specifically toward people who are more vulnerable to a disease isn't a new concept. This is something we've done for pretty much every other disease. And I'm not saying nobody should ever wear a mask at all, period. If you look in the comments section in either my or Professor Stick's video, you'll notice a lot of people seem to have the impression that I'm completely and utterly against masks whatsoever. And that's a vast oversimplification of what my position on masks is exactly. Just because I don't want the government to force people to wear masks 24/7 every moment of their life, doesn't necessarily mean I don't think there's a place for masks. Obviously, if someone either tests positive for COVID or is going to visit someone who's vulnerable, there's probably a strong justification for that person wearing a mask. People who work in hospitals or nursing homes who are around vulnerable people all day, they should probably be wearing masks as well. I mean, just because I think people should wear a life jacket if they're on a boat or near the water doesn't necessarily mean I think people should be forced to wear a life jacket everywhere all the time.
The second point I want to make is that you should look at the total deaths as well. Currently in the US, we have 350,000 deaths? To put that to scale, that is more than 2 times higher than US deaths in World War I, and we are creeping very close to World War II. Ultimately, the number of people this pandemic has killed says something, and we're constantly losing 2,000 to 4,000 people every day. What other man-made or natural event has killed and is killing this many people in just a year's worth of time?
Well, the first thing to point out is that we don't really actually know how many people COVID has killed. This is because a lot of people who've died from COVID also had some sort of other pre-existing condition at the time of their death, which means that a lot of times when people die from COVID, it's unclear whether or not if and to what degree COVID contributed to their death. On top of that, a lot of hospitals are getting grants based on the number of COVID patients they get, which leads to shit like someone going into the hospital for a motorcycle accident and being put down as a COVID death. But even if we were to assume that the current death numbers are accurate, 300,000 deaths in a country of 330 million people equates to 1/100th%, or 1% of 1%, which is actually pretty minuscule. I'm not trying to say that those deaths aren't a tragedy. Of course, any loss of life for any reason is unfortunate, but statistically speaking, is it something that we really need to worry about, especially when you consider that a lot of these so-called remedies that people are suggesting themselves have a death count. Like, these lockdowns are causing a lot of deaths from suicide and starvation. The lockdowns might actually have a higher death count than COVID itself.
The only 2 types of diseases that really fit the category are coronaviruses and flus. That being said, comparing the seasonal flu with COVID-19 is not accurate. Comparing COVID to any existing pathogen is not accurate. The reason COVID is receiving so much attention is because we know nothing about it. At least we didn't know anything about it. By the time this video is uploaded, we already know quite a bit, but in the context of when Dr. Erickson made these statements, we knew nothing.
So on the one hand, you're saying that coronavirus is not in any way comparable to the flu, and on the other hand, you're saying that coronavirus has properties in common with the flu.
In the context of what I said there, I'm talking specifically about deadliness. You can't compare COVID with the flu in that regard. I just see so many people do that and it's just too ridiculous. Now, if you want to compare symptoms, that's another story. And of course, you can do some sort of comparison there since they're both respiratory viruses. Nothing is contradictory in what I said.
There's a reason COVID is constantly being compared to the flu, and that's because COVID is relatively similar to the flu. They're both respiratory illnesses. They both have similar symptoms. They're both similar in how they spread and what demographics are are most vulnerable. They even have roughly the same mortality rate. As a matter of fact, COVID is even less likely to kill you than the flu. The reason people are comparing COVID to the flu is that even though these two diseases are fairly similar, for some reason one of them is worth destroying the economy over. Like the flu is statistically more likely to kill you. So if we're going to destroy the economy and ruin people's lives over COVID, we definitely need to do that for the flu as well. And even if it is the case that COVID is just vastly different from the flu and not similar in any way, that still doesn't necessarily mean that the disease measures we take to protect people against the flu couldn't also work for COVID. If we didn't lock down or force people to wear masks, if we just handled this the same way as we did any other seasonal illness, which we now understand that COVID is, it wanes and spikes in different times of the year, similar to a lot of other seasonal diseases. There's a good chance it could have handled this virus a lot better without all the destruction and mayhem that the lockdowns cause. I mean, we're always being told we need to listen to the experts and listen to the science. Well, my problem with that is that to a significant extent, the experts in science you want us to listen to keep giving us mixed messages.
The only mixed messages that the scientific community would give us is if new information comes up that corrects something previously claimed. Now, of course, that can be frustrating to many people. I get it that you want to know the absolute truth of it all before we had time to analyze the virus itself. However, that can never be the case. When scientists give advice on a certain subject that is the best we know based on our current understanding of the pandemic, it is still the best interpretation. And of course, what we know will constantly evolve as more research is being done, but we can never predict what new things we will discover, so the best course of action is still to listen to what scientists have to say.
So yes, I'm aware of the fact that scientists aren't going to have all the answers right away. I'm aware that it takes time for scientific progress to kind of refine our understanding of things, and of course as new information comes to light, it may render our previous knowledge obsolete. This I am aware of. But let's be honest, there's a little more than that going on here. I mean, how many times has Fauci changed his tune on something? I mean, first it was masks don't work, then it was masks do work but only healthcare professionals need them. Now it's everybody needs masks. And there's several other things they've gone back and forth on. Whether or not COVID can be transmitted through the air, whether or not COVID can be transmitted through surfaces. I mean, yeah, scientific refinement of our understanding of things is one thing, but these guys are constantly jumping around. And Fauci is on record admitted to lying. I mean, just passively not understanding the whole picture is one thing, but no, he's on record admitting that he's lied intentionally before. At the beginning of the pandemic, Fauci said that masks don't work, they actually make things worse, nobody should wear a mask. Well, it turns out the reason he said that wasn't because it's true, it's because he wanted to prevent people from buying up too many masks and making sure that they're available for healthcare workers. Now, of course, you could make the argument that he wasn't lying to be deceitful necessarily, he was just lying to make sure that healthcare workers had the essential PPE that they need. But lying with benevolent intentions is still lying. I mean, why couldn't a Fauci just directly come out and say, hey, we're going to need people from the general population to hold off on buying masks for right now, just so we can make sure that our essential healthcare workers have good access to them. Why he couldn't have been upfront about that instead of lying, nobody really understands. And quite frankly, it should come as no surprise why people are tending to distrust people like Fauci who keep changing their opinion like this, since, you know, they're on record having lied. Even if what they're saying now is truthful and accurate, they've already set the precedent that they are in fact willing to deceive people to push an agenda. So even if they do end up saying something truthful or accurate, we still have no grounds to really trust them. I mean, I just think that lying so much, even with benevolent intentions, was a bad strategic move for them in the long run.
That being said, science is not represented by a single individual. It is a collection of all the scientists in the world.
Yeah, we're not the camp of people worshipping Dr. Fauci. Like, literally worshipping him. Like, usually when I say someone or something is being worshipped, I mean that hyperbolically, but not people are literally trying to deify him. Like, the Pope talked about granting him sainthood, and there was even talk about him getting his own national holiday right before Christmas. Like, could you imagine if right-wingers tried giving their hero a national holiday right before a Jewish or Muslim holiday? Like, the left wing wouldn't be having that at all.
So of course, here and there you will find some crazy people like Dr. Erickson here who spreads nothing but nonsense on social media. But when something like this goes viral, you usually see multiple other scientists speaking out against that person. Since you asked for links about scientists disagreeing with Dr. Erickson, I did put a few sources in my previous video's description, so feel free to check that out.
Well, since Professor Stick here was kind enough to offer that up, I might address those in a future video.
Anyway, back to the topic of mixed messages, you have to learn to pick out the most reliable sources. For example, the CDC.
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
But yeah, fellas, you definitely need to know how to pick out reliable data, especially from large bureaucratic government organizations that are corrupt as hell and are lobbied by special interest groups. Now that's where you can get most of your reliable data. Joking aside though, a lot of data from the CDC actually comports with what we have to say and undermines Professor Stick. For example, there's data from the CDC that suggests that not only is the death rate from COVID actually much lower than people believe it is, but also that masks really aren't all that effective. Links will be in the description, of course.
You can't just always listen to a random podcast on YouTube and think these people know what they're talking about. At least check their credentials first.
When you say random podcast, you make it seem like a teenager in their bedroom somewhere. The podcast I referenced was from Tom Woods, who's not only well-renowned within libertarian circles, but his podcast is also well-known within politics in general. See, his podcast has over 2,000 episodes, millions of listeners, and he invites guests on from all over the world. So it's not like this is some random podcast that some teenager does in their spare time. As for Woods' credentials, he's written multiple books, has been a speaker at multiple events, and whenever he does a podcast regarding some sort of technical concept, he always makes sure that he's inviting experts onto the show to discuss it with him, providing citations to relevant sources. If you go on his website, you can see a wide variety of different articles and data, all of which supported with citations to actual scientific sources. So while the Tom Woods podcast might not necessarily be the type of source that Professor Stick is used to, intellectually speaking, it's definitely worth its salt.
The reason I mentioned this specifically is because in the sources of your video, you linked 2 YouTube videos.
So in the last part of this response, I mentioned that I'll often link to additional sources of information in the description of my videos, if I feel that information is helpful in getting a point across that I make in the video. Now, in case you haven't seen the original response video I made to Professor Stick, I linked to 2 videos in the description. And the reason I linked to these 2 particular videos is because they both do a pretty good job of expanding upon points I mentioned in the video. The first video I linked to is a short video from Shane Killian about masks. Now the reason I linked to this video is because not only do I feel that Killian does an excellent job of summarizing what the libertarian position on masks tends to be. I think Killian in general does an excellent job of explaining things, that's why I'll often link to his videos. But he also expands upon a point I mentioned in the video, which is that for a long time, even long before the pandemic, in a lot of Asian cultures such as China and Japan, it's considered perfectly normal for someone to wear a mask out in public when they're sick as a courtesy to others. And even once the pandemic is over, I wouldn't necessarily mind that becoming a more normal part of our culture here. Because if you recall, my problem isn't necessarily with masks themselves, more with people being forced to wear them. The second video I linked to is an episode of Tom Woods' podcast, as I've mentioned previously. And the particular episode I linked to is based all around masks. In this episode, Tom Woods is discussing the science of masks and their effectiveness. And he actually invites a doctor on the show to discuss it with him. There's actually a lot of interesting facts and tidbits of information in that podcast episode, but the one that stood out to me in particular, and the reason I considered it worthy of being shared in the video description, is that they expand upon a point I brought up in the video, which is that once the masks become saturated with pathogens, it no longer becomes effective at blocking those pathogens, but rather starts spreading them around. I'll link to both videos in the description here as well. I actually recommend watching both videos as they both present a lot of interesting facts and information.
Those are not sources.
Aye, but you see lads, those are not true sources. Those are just YouTube videos. YouTube videos are not true sources.
Sources for scientific claims must come from scientific papers, primary articles published in well-established journals, for example.
So this is an example of the no true Scotsman fallacy. Basically, when you try to argue that something doesn't belong to a certain category or group without giving an explanation as to why, he's basically trying to dismiss the sources of information I provide by trying to argue that since they're YouTube videos as opposed to scientific papers, they don't count as actual sources. Now, at no point do we ever get an explanation of why it's the case that YouTube videos don't count as actual sources. He just kind of makes the claim. Both the videos that I cite are well researched and are fairly accurate in the data they portray. Heck, in the Tom Woods video, Tom Woods actually interviews a doctor or a professional who works in the field. Instead of actually taking an intellectually honest look at the videos that I cite and actually giving an honest evaluation of the factual accuracy of them, he just dismisses them on their face as not real sources because they're in a format he doesn't approve of. Dismissing sources of information because you don't agree with the format, that doesn't strike me as very scientific-like, Professor.
Increasing cortisol levels does negatively impact immune activity through the psychoneuroimmune system pathway. That part is correct. However, there is a huge leap of logic when claiming that wearing masks cause increased cortisol levels. First, you'd be assuming that masks give people anxiety, which realistically is a bad assumption. I don't know anyone who becomes anxious just because of a thin piece of fabric covering their mouths.
Well, sure, having to wear a piece of cloth over your face in and of itself probably isn't going to cause much anxiety. However, there are other things out there that do in fact cause anxiety, and those things combined with the mask are ultimately what's going to cause problems.
If you're implying that masks combined with a variety of other issues could cause anxiety, then maybe it's the other issues that you need to look at, not masks.
I know this is somewhat tangential, but this dude has like the most obnoxious laugh. And yeah, you know what, if I have a lot of other issues in my life causing me stress, I really don't need you forcing me to wear a mask against my will to add on top of that.
Second, cortisol is the result of more long-term stressors, which is also simply not the case here.
Long-term stressors, so you mean like taking away people's sources of income? Being told that if you go and hang out with your friends, you could be potentially killing vast numbers of people? Those sound like long-term stressors to me.
Okay, sure, but we're talking about face masks here. If you want to argue about lockdowns or other types of social distancing, such as not hanging out in large groups, then that's an entirely separate discussion. There's plenty of debate over there on what should be enforced, but that's different than wearing a simple mask over your face.
Well, you see, the problem here is that your argument about this point regarding cortisol seems to be predicated on the assumption that the mask mandates are being implemented in a vacuum, or at least that's the way you seem to be phrasing it at the time. So the main point I was sort of trying to get across there is that it's inaccurate to speak of how much stress or anxiety the masks themselves will cause, because the masks themselves aren't the only thing being forced onto people. When you take into account all of the other factors that come into play, like the lockdowns and shit, the amount of stress inflicted on people by the masks could be different. It's kind of strange that I have to actually explain this to a scientist, but different variables can actually create different results in different environments. The amount of stress that mask mandates cause in a lockdown might be different from the amount of stress they cause without a lockdown. And on top of that, from other videos Professor Stick made, it seems like he does actually support these other measures such as lockdowns. So it's not like it's totally irrelevant to the conversation at hand. One of the major ways that masks are causing stress right now is that they're kind of acting like a forced symbol of the pandemic. You know, they're like a symbol of obedience to the government and their whole campaign of fear-mongering. Like, people just want this shit to be over so they can be free again. And quite frankly, I simply just don't like having restrictions on my breathing. And I hate walking around looking like I'm about to perform an operation just to go to the fucking grocery store.
You're creating actually an increase in respiratory drive because you get more carbon dioxide coming back from the face mask.
Yes, respiratory rate may increase, but it's not going to be an issue unless you have pre-existing breathing conditions.
Yeah, and people with pre-existing breathing conditions don't need to do things like go to the grocery store or go out in public at all.
I've mentioned this in a previous video. If you have pre-existing breathing conditions or have a legit reason not to wear a mask, such as a phobia of suffocation or panic attacks, then yeah, I'm sure everyone can agree you are exempt from wearing a mask. But if you have an illegitimate reason, such as it infringes upon my personal liberties, then absolutely not.
You're not the boss of me now. You're not the boss of me now. You're not the boss of me now, and you're not so big.
Hey Stick Boy, guess what? Blow it out your ass, buddy. I'll wear whatever the hell I want for whatever reason I want. It's my face, I don't feel like covering it, that's all the reason I fucking need. In all seriousness though, nobody's saying you can't wear a mask if you want to. You'll often hear this argument from people who advocate for mask mandates that we're not asking for much, just a small piece of cloth over your face. Well, by that same token, I feel like what we're asking for isn't a lot either. Just a choice. Like recently, I'm sure you've heard in the news that Texas, Mississippi, and several other states either have already abolished their mask mandates or are planning to do so. And the liberals are losing their goddamn minds. Nobody's saying that people who want to wear masks shouldn't be able to. Nor is anyone saying that nobody should be able to encourage others to wear masks voluntarily. You have a First Amendment right to free speech and free self-expression. That presumably includes the right to speak out about the virtues of mask wearing and try to get people on board with it. Don't go up to people with a gun and make them wear a mask. That's all we're asking for. And guess what? Even in places where there aren't official mask mandates from the government, a lot of private businesses are still having rules in place that say you have to wear a mask in order to do business with us. Like, I'm okay with business owners setting the rules for their establishment. Like, if you would feel more comfortable shopping at a business that required everyone to wear masks, then you can go ahead and make that decision. Just let me go to a business that doesn't require masks. Just give us a choice. That's all we're asking for.
Alright, I think we've gone on long enough. There's still a lot of video left, but I don't think there's any way I'm making a part 3.
Aw, that's a shame, Stick Boy. I was looking forward to hearing what you have to say about the rest of my video, but oh well. Joking aside though, in the final part of the video, I make a few more points sympathetic of mask wearing. In particular, I point out that in Asian cultures, it's actually considered normal for someone to go out in public with a mask when they're feeling sick as a courtesy as to not get others around them sick. I also make a few points regarding the ethics of the government forcing people to wear masks against their will. Joking aside, I am curious to know what Professor Stick's opinion would be on these points. points, but oh well. Overall, I think this is actually a huge improvement from his first response. He seems to be approaching my criticisms with more intellectual honesty this time, which, truth be told, I do appreciate. I'll give him credit where credit's due. But my biggest problem here with this response is how he just hand waves away my sources like that. Like he just on its face dismisses them just because they're YouTube videos, doesn't actually bother looking at them and going into the detail and the arguments being brought forward. So Professor Stick, if you happen to be watching this video, my challenge to you would be to watch in detail both of those videos that I linked, and for your convenience I'll link them again here in this video. Watch them, try to understand the arguments being put forward, and maybe even come up with a response to them. But yeah, I think that's where I'll end the video for here. Once again, as always, this has been Philosophopossum making stupidity play dead. Take care, everyone.
I wear my face mask in my car so I can virtue signal